My guest today spent a year visiting and researching America's national parks ahead of the centennial celebration of their creation several years ago. Mark Woods is author of Lassoing the Sun, A Year in America's National Parks. He's also a Florida Times Union columnist. Mark, thanks so much for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, a lot of people have been watching the actions of this new administration with concern around the issue of national parks. How have you been sort of receiving the news of the last few months as it pertains to the national park system?
Yeah, it's pretty like a lot of things, it's pretty shocking. I was gonna kinda start by going back to kind of the premise of what led the book was this, uh, fellowship I won in spending the year in 2012 in the national parks, and kind of the premise for this project was that, it was gonna be the centennial of the National Park Service in 2016, and that many people from John Muir to Ken Burns had wonderfully and beautifully documented the first 100 years of our National Park Service. But what did the next 100 years kind of hold for the national park? So that's kind of how I went into this project. I was going to spend a year. I was going to go to one park a month, and each one was going to kind of symbolize a different issue for the future. And so everywhere I went, that was every person I was interviewing with the parks. I was kind of thinking, what's ahead? And so I immersed, a year of my life in reporting and a lot of time thinking about the future, and I didn't see coming what's happening now. If anything, the centennial felt like this launching pad of there was so much celebration, so much hype that I really felt like we'd be taking off, and our national parks they had maintenance backlogs, they had issues going on. I felt like we were going to overcome some of those things, not go backwards. And yeah, so I've studied this simple question: what does the future hold? And here we are, 9 years later after centennial, and yeah, it's being dismantled in a way, potentially in a way that we've never seen before.
Your book, which was very well received, it was blurbed by Ken Burns. It won the 2016 Florida Book Awards in the category of general nonfiction, and it's an excellent and beautiful and very moving read. But as you say, at the time, you were exploring all kinds of pressures that the national park system faces. Stagnant appropriations, understaffing. Um, Concerns about climate change and the pressure of growth and the pressure of crowds that were, bigger and bigger every year. And all of those things remain real challenges for national parks. And yet they seem secondary, doesn't even seem quite appropriate given, what we know is coming and has already begun coming. The biggest thing to sort of kick this off were these huge, um, large scale dismissals of staff. Some of them probationary, some of them long time kind of in new positions, but that's a big chunk of people to lose. What's the feeling about what the staff cutbacks, how those might impact the parks?
Yeah, I mean, if you talking to superintendents going back to that pre-centennial time, they talked about needing more staff. We're understaffed, and you could see and feel that in places that were, huge crowds, and but you could also see it in smaller parks. And so they'd often say, "We need more people, we need more funding." And, in that centennial year, I think it was 320 million visits, and it was record, for our National Park Service. Last year, that was broken, more than 330 million visits. So it's not like these places have become less popular and have less visitors. Um, you need more staff, more funding. The budget is less than 1/10 of 1% of our federal budget. And whenever you've done polls in the past and asked people, do you support, however you phrase it, national parks, do you support their funding? It's overwhelming. And I used to, when I'd talk about, the book came out, I'd talk about, there was some poll that showed like 95% support or something. I said, there is, find me anything else in America that 90%, 5% of Americans agree upon. So it's like the one thing that we agreed upon. We
Yeah,
need to
you'd be hard
protect.
pressed to get an apple pie poll that high, you
Yeah,
know?
right, right. So yeah, to see we're going to cut, that one day, Valentine's Day, 1,000 probationary employees. But since then, there's been other people taking the buyouts, and I think the stat is the Park Service is down just this year, down 12% of its staffing. So you're cutting staff, you're cutting, budgets potentially. Um, so yeah, it is on many different levels, dramatic. There's talk of making superintendents appointed, which would be like, I'm going to give somebody this ambassadorship, and do they have expertise? Right now, the superintendents are very good at what they do. I'm sure you could find some that have risen and maybe don't deserve that job, but most of them are, professionals who've spent years in the Park Service or have some other expertise that really qualifies them to have that job, not just a political appointee, which that would be the retired Park Service folks are really worried about that. That's something I've heard from them.
That would just become a patronage job for someone loyal to
Right,
the administration.
right.
Yeah. Your story began as an exploration of the state parks, the challenges, their history, and their future. But it also, evolved into a personal story because during the course of your fellowship, your mother was diagnosed with cancer and she died of cancer during the course of the book while you were working on it. And so, it also became an exploration of grief and kind of how these national parks are part of our family history and our collective memory because you did a lot of exploring with your parents when you were a child to some of these same places. And I wonder, you talk about the experience that people will be having at these national parks with, a 20% staff cut. We know that some of those staff members, could be safety related, but some of them could be, like at Yellowstone, they've said it's the person who operates the sewage treatment system, right? So that could make for a very unpleasant experience for visitors if something malfunctions at that level. I just wonder how you think it will impact kind of how you experienced parks and your family has experienced the national parks, what sort of impact it would have if those staffing shortages
Yeah,
kind of manifest in that way.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you saw it immediately. Like I think the Saturday after those probationary cuts, they were saying there were like 4 hour lines to get in the Grand Canyon. You have anecdotes about, well, we've got a biologist cleaning the bathroom in such and such a park because there's nobody else there to do it that day, or we've got um, one park they had one EMT and he was laid off. There's just yeah, the busiest parks. I don't think I'd want to visit Yosemite this summer. The places that are already kind of stressed to the kind of the idea of, one of the things I looked at in the book was loving our parks to death, not loving them enough. And, the Jonathan Jarvis, who was the Park Service director at that point, said, I'm more worried about not loving them enough. We need to, as Americans, make sure everybody loves their park. And that was his mission. We can deal with loving them to death. Um, and now I feel like that's part of the equation that really needs to be tipped. We need to, as Americans, say, yeah, these are places we love and we need to protect and we need to stand up for them. Um, and yeah, one of the epiphanies during that year, in hindsight, it probably really shouldn't have been, was that I thought of national parks as these places like, okay, you created a national park. When you did that, you basically locked it up, threw away the key, and it's preserved forever. Um, Um, but I remember visiting with the Grand Canyon superintendent, and he said he was a new superintendent. He said he'd been in the Park Service for a while, but he said, "This is, dream job. I've basically been handed the most protected place on earth, one of the most protected places on earth. What do you think I do every day?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Try and protect it because it's
Mm.
under attack for." At that point, there were all these people trying to do I think it was 75,000 flights from both directions. Um, there was battles over the water running through it. There was an attempt to build this kind of tram down into the Grand Canyon just outside the border, but it would affect. Um, so he said there were all these things, that ways that the Grand Canyon was under attack. So he was like, this is the most one of the most protected places on earth, but I spend every waking moment trying to protect it. And that was more broadly, that. these things places aren't preserved, that's something forever. That's something we have to do again and again, day after day, year after year, generation after generation, and it's both on the micro level, me handing it down, my parents handing it down to me handing it down to my daughter, hopefully, but also on a macro level. We have to do that as a country, and if those things don't happen, we don't have our national parks.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to author and columnist Mark Woods about the challenges facing national parks. You can join our conversation by giving us a call at 904-549-2937 or emailing firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You mentioned Jarvis, in terms of when he was working his philosophy of, the state parks. In his retirement, he has discussed the real threats to state parks.
National parks, yeah.
Excuse me. Well, I was actually gonna say, I mean, we sort of learned a lesson here
Yes,
last year
yes.
with our state parks, right? In terms
Right,
of, like,
right,
are they there in perpetuity or will they become a giant lodge with pickleball courts?
right,
And the citizens of this state said, kind of a no-go on that proposal, but it does show that there is, like, no forever when it comes to these creations.
right.
Things can change, and he recently wrote an op-ed that I think you have in front of you that talks about the risk of just straight up privatization of some
Right.
aspects of the park, further privatization of some aspects of the park because there has been a little bit, concessions and things like that. Um, what is he worried about?
Um, yeah, he's worried that this is so dramatic that, that there's so many different things happening. It kinda rattles them off. He talks about severely slash the budget, force retirements of dedicated, experienced MPS leaders, terminate the employment of those who refuse, cut the staffs, replace park and superintendents with political appointees, to do the private sector's bidding, and that these places will not run well, and that actually will be part of the plan, and then they'll say, "Look, private sector can do this better than government, and let's have the private sector," but it's just he fears it's just gonna chip away more and more at the places that are preserved, the way they're preserved, and, he and others aren't against, private sector involvement, like you said, concessionaires. There's a lot of things that are not run by the National Park Service, and they're fine with that. But this feels different than that, and it kind of it applies to the state parks. What you were talking about that there's a John Muir quote that I use often um, is when Yosemite, there's another valley, not Yosemite Valley, Hetch Hetchy nearby, and they dammed it and flooded it. It was considered one of the most beautiful spots in Yosemite, and it was a battle he lost, but he said nothing tolerable is safe, however guarded,
Mm.
and that I think of that over and over that nothing tolerable is safe, and he said you have to keep kind of back to that, keep fighting for these places and say, we need to protect them. If you want to talk about dollars, they have a massive economic impact. I mean, the tourism dollars of our national parks are huge, not just for the parks, for the outlying communities, for the outdoor recreation industry. Um, these are economic uh, generators. So the idea that, "Oh, we need to find ways to make money," they make money. They produce, and, they're just but sometimes that shouldn't be the reason for doing something. We should just have these places.
The it's interesting to look back at a column that you wrote at the very beginning of the current president's first term. You kind of perchance had been in Cumberland Island the morning of the inauguration back in 2017
Yeah.
and ended up writing a column about it. Not so much about, uh, well, about the fact that this battle between the president and the National Park Service kind of kicked off almost immediately. Remind us what precipitated that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, yeah, I had this plan to spend I didn't even think I've since done this repeatedly where I spend a inauguration day on Cumberland. It's kinda become my little thing to, "Okay, I feel safe and comfortable, and this is good," and, just distant myself from politics, and in the past, I would have said that's was the beauty of the national parks, that they were largely immune to politics. They were, beloved by both Democrats and Republicans. Republican presidents, I wrote about, they have this legacy of conservation and preservation from Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Yosemite Grant Act, to Theodore Roosevelt, who you mentioned, to Richard Nixon, even signed Clean Air Act. Ronald Reagan, when he was reelected, said, "What is a conservative after all but one who conserves, and we want to protect and conserve the land on which we live." Um, so yeah, I spent that day over there and kind of told myself, well, I don't know what's going to lie ahead in the next 4 years. And this is 2016, the year the book came out. The following January, Donald Trump is elected. But I felt like, well, I'm hopeful that the parks will be okay. Um, that this is a thoroughly American thing, that it has been supported again and again. But then I get back and I learn on day one, what's the first kind of silly, crazy feud of the Trump administration was, as you recall, his inauguration crowd size, where the National Park Service, which historically has always analyzed how many people were there for inauguration crowd, said his was not as big as Obama's. And, instead of just, not, he made that a big deal for days. That was the first one of the first big controversies. And I remember thinking at that time, uh-oh, maybe.
And calling the head of the National Park Service to complain
Yes.
about, photos that they'd posted,
Yeah.
and did they fairly depict his crowd, which he thought was larger, which it wasn't, but
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
And the Park Service has since stopped giving crowd size estimates for events at the National Mall, just kind of like, well, okay, that nothing good can come of us trying to estimate the crowd size.
Nothing good can come of it. I actually thought that that stopped after the Million Man March.
It may have, yeah.
Yeah, but
Okay.
still a political
Yeah.
minefield that they didn't
Right.
choose to get into. I wanted to just add a little more to that quote from Ronald Reagan. This is something that you also quoted, but
Mhm.
he went on to say that national parks, they're our patrimony. It's what we leave to our children, and our great moral responsibility is to leave it to them either as we found it or better than we found it. And I think it just sort of makes you question, since he's saying, he's framing this is what a conservative is. It's sort of like, what is a conservative today, if not somebody that's conservation minded? I mean, we really do think of Teddy Roosevelt as um, kind of the personal model of that philosophy,
Mhm.
saving the great outdoors and all of the work that he did on the parks.
Yeah, and I think that's often something that we can find when I've written about kind of old Florida and natural Florida, common ground politically, that you have people both left, right, who appreciate old Florida, natural Florida, and I think on a national level too. So that's what's little. Um, that's what more than a little disappointing now, and troubling and concerning. I hope that comes through, that Americans care about these places. I mean, there's another quote I like that I've used often, is from a past president of the Nature Conservancy. It was, "In the end, our society will be defined not only by what we create, but by what we refuse to destroy."
Mm.
And I think about that one sometimes. Yeah, that if if you went to the Grand Canyon and tried to create a Canyon, imagine how much that would cost. Get some contractors, and I'm gonna fill it with these animals and this flora and fauna, and um, these places, you can't put a price
It's
tag on them.
incalculable. I mean,
Yeah,
there's no way to
yeah.
even imagine creating something quite like that. Um, we got an email from Kathy Stark. She's actually the artist that has created this series of posters for the National Park Service, sort of based on the WPA park posters from that era. And she says, this summer, I predict Americans will get very upset with long lines, dirty parks, and disorganized amenities, lack of ranger experiences. These Doge cuts will backfire on the Republican Party. Americans will get upset and protest and vote this down the line. It is in a similar to she said, I think it means it is similar to Floridians rising up and protesting about trying to develop our state parks with golf courses and pickleball, which is something that we mentioned. What do you think? I mean, certainly people, as you say, theoretically support national parks, but there are a lot of different things, a lot of different agencies, and kind of some beloved programs under attack, whether it's, things like Medicare and Medicaid or even, Sesame Street. I mean, there's this kind of gamut of things that people really care about in theory, and yet there's a lot of um, targets that people are sort of distracted. There's so many things that people are kind of looking at with maybe concern about defunding.
Absolutely. Yeah, so which ones which do you stand up for? Um, I hope this will be one of them. I mean, that was another thing when I finished the book and was out, doing speaking engagements and things, people would say, "What are your hopes and fears, and are you concerned?" And I say, "Yes." And they'd say, "What can we do?" And at that point, I think I even wrote this in the epilogue of the book. So, I'm writing that in 2015, a decade ago. At that point, I said, "Go to the parks. Even better, if you have children, take your children to your grandchildren and get the next generation." And I said, "You don't have to be an activist. You don't have to be, chaining yourself to a tree or whatever, but you just go to the parks. That's all really you need to be." Now I feel, um, it requires more than that because we have been going to the parks. Like I said, 330 villain visits last year, which, is more in that Jonathan Jarvis op-ed. He wrote that's more than, Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, and Disney combined last year.
Wow.
That's the number of visits to national parks last year. So people have been going to them. That is not enough to protect them. Now I think we do need to speak up and say, "No, this is wrong. This is a fraction of our budget, and these places are beloved, and we need to save them." And it's not just the Yosemites and Yellowstones. That's part of the budget item was pretty troubling to see. That it calls for like $1 billion cut in their budget, reducing it by 25%. And it basically talked about how um, National Park Service oversees a large number of sites, quote, that are not national parks, quote, end quote, in the traditionally understood sense. And I think what that means is there's 400 some National Park Service sites. It gets kind of confusing that there's the 63 that we think of as the large, they have national park in the name, but there's places like right in our backyard, Cumberland Island National Seashore, Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve. Um,
The
you know,
National Monument in St. Augustine,
yes, Castillo de San
Castillo.
Marcos, um, Fort Caroline National Memorial. Those are all pieces of the National Park Service, and I feel like those are important pieces of the National Park Service, and I don't want them. They've talked about maybe those just go back. Some of the lesser pieces is how they view it. Just go back to the states or local municipalities. Um, you know, I feel like the 63 are special, although I dispute a few of them. But the other pieces have their place in our national park system. Something like, there's Gettysburg, or Independence Hall, so some of them are mainly historic sites. To me, the best of the places are both these grand environmental places, but also with these really rich histories. Um, but put them all together, I don't want it just stripped down to, oh, we're going to have Yosemite, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, and those are our national parks. I feel like um, that big puzzle of all these 400 is pretty magical. We talk about America's best ideas, what's been used over and over again since the Ken Burns documentary, and it goes back to a Wallace Stegner quote from 100 years ago. And I was thinking about that driving here. It's not just America's best idea, it's something we've executed pretty well. Our national parks, they are something we've done well as a nation and are admired. Um, when I would travel that year, when I was working on the book, I'd bump into, foreign visitors, and they'd say, "Do you Americans know what you have here?" And they'd say, "We if we were gonna have a contest on, cathedrals or, this or that, we can kick you. We've got way better than that, but we don't have national parks like you have, and do Americans realize that?" And I'd say, "Yes and no," I think. I think a lot of Americans appreciate what we have, but I even then was, fearful not enough do. So that's, I hope we will realize what we have, and we will work hard to protect them.
I want to take a call from John. He's a question about McCoy's Creek. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Oh, well, good morning, Ann, and thank you for taking my call. And let me just say that Mark Woods is a Jacksonville treasure. Yeah, I'm on McCoy's Creek. I'm right underneath the 1929 marker, underneath the former Times Union building where Mark was. And yeah, I've already caught 3 redfish. And, when I think of the National Park Service, and I think of the acronyms, the NPS, and then when I always think of Mark Woods, I think of NPS, the National Paddleboard Spot. That man is awesome
Mm.
when it comes to, a paddleboard. And, I had the opportunity to see Ken Burns at the Times Union Center years ago. And he always asked the question, who are we as Americans? So we have, America's best idea, the parks system. And I would just ask Mark, for Jacksonville's best idea. I'm going to be going to the Jacksonville Waterways Commission today at 2 o'clock. And I would hope Mark would, even where I'm at right now, just on McCoy's Creek, I believe it still could be saved. And, but anyway,
Well, let me put
I
that
just
question to
also,
Mark, John. Let me ask him that since we've only got a short time left. I mean, is there Jacksonville's best idea? Is the Timucuan kind of that for you, or are there other? I mean, and
That's
as he
that's
notes, you're out on the water almost every day with your paddleboard up and down the
um,
river. So
I mean, yeah, the Timucuan Preserve is certainly, and our parks in general, this is something I think we've been talking about since, the 25 years I've lived here, that we have this, one of the best, biggest urban park systems in America, but how do we make it the best? And, so that's a conversation I think I and others wanna keep having, um, and, yes, something like our National Park Service piece of our local parks is a hugely significant piece, but, yeah, that to me, that should be our DNA, our marketing. We should be this, natural Florida. That's what we should lean into here in Jacksonville, and we've done that to a certain degree, but I wanna see us do it even more.
it's interesting when you talk about the cuts proposed and sort of maybe the categories of parks and assets that the National Park Service oversees. Looking at sort of like these iconic, famous places like Yellowstone, Yosemite, things like that. And then perhaps what they're viewing is maybe places that don't draw as much in the way of tourism or generate as much in the way of revenue, or are more locally significant than nationally significant. Really, truly, the Timucuan would kind of fall into that category, would it not? I mean, if you were going to be sort of looking at like how a Doge or a ranking system might say, well, that's Florida's piece of land, but is it really a giant tourist destination? Is it a huge moneymaker? Um, the impacts would be enormous if that was no longer a protected piece of land.
Right, I mean, I think when you read how that's written, what they say is like, "Oh, yeah, we'll leave these familiar name ones alone," but, I've always said that the name of our local national park, Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve, is a mouthful, and it's very fitting because it is both ecological and historic, amazing amount of both, but it sometimes confuses people because they don't realize we have national park land right here, national park rangers, um, and yes, it isn't, going to draw the visitors, like a Yosemite or Yellowstone, but it is an important piece to us locally, and it also it does draw people who are kind of fascinated oh, this is, this kind of ecosystem isn't there's not a lot of it left on the Eastern Seaboard, so
No.
we've managed to preserve it, and, things we take for granted, visitors come from other parts of the country or world and like, "Oh, our marshes," and, some of the so that, to me, is a fitting piece of our national park system. I love that it's a piece of our national park system, and I'd be sad to not have it a part of our national park system.
I mean, sometimes the most remarkable thing about the elements of our park system is that they have been saved.
Yes, absolutely. And that's often sometimes political, the creation of these places. You see that again and again in the stories, in the Ken Burns documentary, how some place came to be preserved. There's always the battles, and often it's like pushback and then like you see this in some of the Alaska national parks, and like decades later, if you said we're gonna take that away, no, you're not. Like, the people there, rally around those places and, want them preserved and protected, and that's happened again and again.
Well, hopefully that will happen. Some rallying around our national parks this time. Mark Woods, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.